Thanks, Aliyah. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Professor Mauro Nobili. It's a good friend of mine. Professor Nobili is he comes from us from Illinois. He's a professor of African history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's a member of the Council of International African Institutes and former chair of Islam in Africa Studies Group. His research focuses on the history of West African Muslim societies from the late Middle Ages to the early colonial period. He has published several book articles in journals such as book articles in journals such as History in Africa, the Journal of African History, as well as book chapters and 2 collections of essays. He has also published 3 monographs, and he has another one that he did. He was very humble. He didn't mention it here, but it's under review with Edinburgh University Press. But his 3 monographs among them is Sultan, the Caliph, and the Renewer of the Faith, Aḥmad Lobbo, and the Tarikh al-Fattash, and the Making of an Islamic State in 19th Century West Africa. This book was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press, and also was published in Mali by the Institut des Hautes Études de Recherche Islamique Ahmed Baba de Timbuktu. The book reconstructs the intertwined histories of a political project, the legitimation of an important West African state, and the Khalifa of Hamdallah, 1818-1862, and of a chronicle, the Tarikh al-Fattash. His new monograph, co-authored with Zachary Wright and Ali Jakite, is coming out in October with the title of The Chronicles of 2 West African Kingdoms, the Tarikh of Ibn al-Mukhtar of the Songhai Empire and the Tarikh al-Fattash of the Khalifa of Hamdallah, published with the series Font Historia Africana and Liverpool University Press, with the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities grant. The book presents the edition and translation of 2 crucial sources of the history of pre-colonial West Africa, with essays that shed light on the history of the region between the 15th and the 19th century. So please join me in welcoming Mauro Nobili.
Well, thank you very much, Khaled, for your generous introduction. I would like to thank you, all of the staff of the African Studies Center, including Aliyah, Marissa Morman, Jeremy Foltz, and also Harry, who I suspect is not here anymore because of this hard time of funds, but who helped me in making this happening. So I really, really appreciated his help. And especially appreciate the opportunity I'm given today because I have a strong connection with William Brown, despite the fact that I never met him, an intellectual connection that started when sometimes in the mid-2000s, I was trying to understand what I wanted to do with my PhD. And an acquaintance of mine sent me photocopies of his dissertation from Yale. And the dissertation by William Brown, The Caliph of Hamdallah, remained for 50 years the only major contribution in English, kind of book-length contribution in English, until I published the book that Khaled mentioned, Sultan Caliph and the Renewer of the Faith, in which I really expanded on several of the insights of William Brown. So it's really, for me, like an incredible opportunity to pay homage to William Brown. But I'm not really here to present Brown as a brilliant scholar, historians. We know this kind of stuff. Nor I think I'm here to repeat what Medina Cham did last year in a fantastic talk, which she located Brown, within his general interest. I mean, the scholarship of William Brown is the general interest in the investment, in his investment for the study and the promotion of the culture of the African diaspora. I want to focus specifically on his role that's not very much acknowledged as a meticulous collector of Arabic manuscripts. So I will focus on what I described elsewhere as a hidden collection. That is a collection of Arabic manuscripts that William Brown collected in West Africa, and that I've explored in an article I published 2 years ago on the Journal of African History with my colleague Nobili Bousbina, who is currently at the University of Hamburg. So this is a collection that comprises 5 reels of microfilms of manuscripts that Brown photographed in the 1960s. Later in the 1970s, these 5 reels were incorporated into a bigger project, kind of a failed project, I must say, that is called the Malian Arabic Microfilming Project. It was based at Yale and meant in concentrating in one single venue the research on Arabic manuscript from Mali conducted by different scholars involved, David Robinson, John Anwick, Louis Brenner, etc. Then eventually this collection had been digitized by the Center for Research Library in the early 2000s. And in early 2020s, the center granted me and my colleague Bousbina some funds to reorganize this collection, provide metadata, and make it available to the public. And we're still on the process of working through the collection, but the first part of the collection, the one that we completed, were the 5 reels from William Brown, because of that specific relevance for my own research. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mission that William Brown conducted in Mali in the 60s. But then I want to show you the potentials of this collection. I could have done it in a very pedantic and boring way by showing you interesting stuff in the collection. I don't want to do that. So what I will do, I will kind of introduce you to, for the first time actually, I'm presenting on what is going to be my next book project that is titled Timbuktu, the Queen of England and the French Invasion of the Sahara. And this is a book that uses a lot of the manuscripts that William Brown collected. So I'll use my book project to talk about the potentials of this collection. So this is the setting. Brown conducted, from what I understand from his own notes, 3 missions in West Africa, in Mali, between 66, 67, and 68. But there is a fantastic resource for us to understand the history of Brown's missions in West Africa, which is the biography of a Malian scholar that was mentioned actually last year by Medina Cham. His name was Almami Malik Yattara, who was the local contact of William Brown, the person who helped him through his manuscript hunting missions in West Africa, and is described by Brown as basically a person originally a Tuareg who had become acculturated into the Fulani, societies of the area of the Caliphate of Hamdallahi, so the space that Brown worked on, and that is particularly knowledgeable about, Arabic and Islamic societies of the region. He was an assistant of the very famous Malian traditionalist Amadou Hampâté-Bâ. So through the eyes of Al-Mali Malik Yattara, I am going to tell you the story of Brown's missions in Mali. So the first mission in 66 took place mostly in the region between Ségou and San, you can see there in the southeastern part of Mali, and the area where the Caliphate of Hamdallahi emerged, which is basically this one, resulted in very few manuscripts that were collected, so not particularly successful. But really the missions that changed the collection, that allowed Brown to collect a lot of manuscripts, was the 1967 one, where he spent most of his time in Timbuktu, and when Brown put his hands on what he calls the fabulously rich manuscript collection of a Moroccan bibliophile whose name is Aḥmad Boularaf. So Boularaf is a fascinating character. He was originally from Morocco. He settled as a trader in Timbuktu, but he really loved books. So he became, in a few decades, the most important book collector of Timbuktu. Brown did not meet Aḥmad Boularaf, who had died in the 60s, but he spent time with his son, Mohammed Abdullah Boularaf, who is described basically as a retired teacher, partly Moroccan, partly Tuareg, owner of a large library, and was very much known for his knowledge of the history of the region. According to the information I gathered from Brown and Yattara, they consulted 15,000 manuscripts, which seems a little bit a lot, but this is the only estimate that I have to quantify the materials that they went through. But it was not just Ahmed Boularaf library that Brown consulted. He also met with another very famous historian of Timbuktu, whose name was Moulay Ahmed Baber, who was also a teacher of Arabic in Timbuktu. You can see here the description that Brown has on Moulay Ahmed Baber, who was also well known for being the author of the last of the great chronicles of Timbuktu. He wrote this book on the history of Timbuktu called Saada al-Abadiya that exists both in print. It's been recently edited by the Ahmed Baba Center in Timbuktu. Then in 1968, Brown went back to Mali with Yattara, but Yattara's narrative of that trip mostly focuses on his wedding. So it looks like Brown really supported Yattara's wedding. So I don't think there was much going on in terms of collection, but it was mostly, the preparation of the wedding of Malik Yattara, which I think is a nice way to testify to the connection that was established between this American scholar and his Malian colleague. So in the article that I mentioned before from 2023, Said Bousbina and I provide like an introduction to this collection, underlining that most of the manuscript from that corridor that we saw on the map between Timbuktu and Jenne. And it is quite a standard collection that you would imagine from West Africa. There is legal opinions, there is historical chronicles, lots of letters, poems, Sufi materials, treatises on theologies or on Islamic law. What is very interesting is that while some of the materials that he collected is well known from other libraries, some other materials are only known nowadays through the manuscript collected by William Brown. So, as I mentioned, I want to focus on my next book project that is centered around two main characters. Is Ahmed al-Bakkāy, a local scholar, Heinrich Barth, who is a German traveler, and the polity in which they basically encounter the Caliphate of Abdullahi, so the focus of both my research and William Brown research for this book, Timbuktu, the Queen of England and the French invasion of the Sahara. This is not really what is happening. Writing in seclusion nicely, this is an inspiration. I've done a lot of research on the project, but not much writing yet. So you folks are kind of the guinea pigs for me to talk a little bit about the ideas behind the book. And what I will do, I will first introduce you the main ideas of the book, the main characters, and then show you how some of the materials in the Brown collection allows me to increase on our understanding of the Timbuktu side of the story that I'm trying to tell you. So the Caliphate of Abdullahi existed in this space. This is the Middle Niger. You saw it in the previous map with the political boundaries of Mali. So Abdullahi kind of occupied the territories along the river Niger between Timbuktu, that is up there, and Jenne, that is below here in the map. And this is the capital city, Abdullahi. So that's the polity that Brown worked on in his PhD dissertation. And the characters I'm also focusing on, Ahmed al-Bakkāy and Barth, also figure prominently in William Brown's research. So who was Ahmed al-Bakkāy? We have a quite interesting kind of visual depiction given by European traveler Heinrich Barth of Bakkāy as a man of about 50 years of age, rather above middle height, fully proportionate, with a cheerful, intelligent, and almost European countenance, of a rather blackish complexion, and whiskers of tolerable length intermingled with some gray hair and with dark eyelashes. But who was Ahmed al-Bakkāy? He was a key figure in a very influential clerical lineage that dominated the economic and intellectual life of Timbuktu in the 19th century. It's called the Kunta, where originally Berber local families, but at that time claimed Arabic origins. He was a very famous scholar. In every collection of West Africa, you will always find something that Ahmed al-Bakkāy wrote. He was extremely prolific, with more than 20 treatises that he penned. He wrote several poems and countless letters. It's really complicated to kind of map down the scholarly production of Ahmed al-Bakkāy. But most importantly, he was also a very respected conflict mediator. This is a very typical institution of the Sahel and the Sahara, where certain scholars who were detached from political power would serve as mediators between disputes that involved local actors. I'm saying this because al-Bakkāy yielded a strong authority, despite the fact he did not occupy any political position. So this is the main character of my book, very well documented in the Brown collection. The counterpart of the story is this German traveler. We do, in fact, have a depiction of Barth. He also has kind of interesting mustaches like al-Bakkāy. So Barth was German, from Hamburg originally, but he traveled in West Africa for 5 years, between 1850 and 1855, on behalf of the British government, with the goal of establishing connections with local authorities. And he traveled basically from Tripoli into central Sudanic area, Sokoto, and then going up all the way to Timbuktu. So he arrives in Timbuktu. This comes from Barth's own travelogue, the image. So he arrived in Timbuktu on September the 7th, 1853. And he was hosted by Aḥmad al-Bakkāy until March 1854. But these months were extremely problematic. So what happens when Barth arrives in Timbuktu? The ruler of the Caliphate of Hamdallahi, who at the time was a name called Aḥmad III, for the 3 rulers of Hamdallahi, all called Aḥmad. So Aḥmad I, the second, and the third. So this is the last of the Aḥmad. Requested to the governor of Timbuktu to deliver Heinrich Barth on the accusation of having entered illegally his territories and basically being a spy. He wanted his belongings to be confiscated, but Bakkāy prevented this from happening. So he protected Barth and prevented the imprisonment. So there is a substantial tension that escalates between Aḥmad al-Bakkāy and his supporters and Aḥmad III, the ruler of Hamdallahi, and his own supporters in the city. So we got to a point in which there is very vivid description, for example, of Bakkāy and Barth spending the night like with guns pointed to the door, waiting for a mob from Timbuktu to come and take over Barth. Or we have other narratives, for example, in which Bakkāy couldn't secure the safety of Barth, so he decided to take him out of town and retired into basically the Tuareg camps. The Tuareg were big supporters of Aḥmad al-Bakkāy in the face of the contingents of soldiers that were coming from the capital in order to secure the delivery of Barth. So eventually the story finishes kind of okay, because Bakkāy managed to protect Barth and eventually leaves, as I mentioned, in March, despite their connection continues until their death in 1865. They both die a few years distant. So normally, this is not a new story that I'm telling here. Again, it's also in Brown's dissertation. But the standard interpretation of the story is that Aḥmad al-Bakkāy's protection of Barth was basically a reflection of West African Islamic cosmopolitanism that was rooted in Sufi hospitality, in legal openness, and an accommodationist approach to European presence that is always countered with some kind of essentialist and fanatic attitude of Aḥmad III. It's always described as the fanatic Fulani. I think that the story is way more complex than that. And I think we are particularly well positioned to understand this story better because the encounter between Bakkāy and Barth and what happens in the 20 years, basically, the 10 years before their death, produced a lot of documents that have survived until today that provide us with a very rich documentation for us to understand better the story of the relationship and the implication of the encounter between Bakkāy and Heinrich Barth. So I call this exceptionally concentrated archive the Barth Archive, which is multi-site. I've collected materials from Timbuktu, both the State Archive, the Ahmed Baba Center that Khaled mentioned, in his introduction to the talk, but also private libraries in Timbuktu, including the Muhammad Tahar Library. We also, Khaled and I, collaborated to set up some work being done there. But also the British Archive in London, the Staatsarchiv in Hamburg, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Archive d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence. It is multi-language, There's materials in Arabic, English, German, Italian, even in Hausa. It is an archive that comprises correspondence between Aḥmad al-Bakkāy and different actors, between Barth and different actors, between other actors involved into this messy time when Barth was in Timbuktu under the protection of al-Bakkāy. Then we have diaries. Barth was writing, obviously, several diaries along his trip. And we even have a diary, I mean, more than a diary, as an autobiography that was dictated in Hausa by one of Barth's servants, that has been eventually recorded down in the end of the 19th century by a German linguist and then translated into English. And then we have a set of legal documents that were produced around this set of events. So this is really a rich archive, which I don't call the Aḥmad al-Bakkāy archive, not because I'm privileging Heinrich Barth, but simply because this documentation is mostly produced because of Barth. But within this archive, we have a lot of African voices, including the one of Aḥmad al-Bakkāy. And in fact, the Brown collection provides us that side of the story. I will get back to that in a second. This is just an image of the 5 volumes published journal by Heinrich Barth in the first edition. So I think that this very dense archive offers itself to a microhistorical analysis that reveals, from my point of view, a complex history of African agency at the eve of European imperialism and eventually colonization. Obviously, I'm here referring to to microhistory as a historical approach, very strong in the Italian tradition of history. Maybe there's something, in me as an Italian that, privileges this kind of microhistorical approach. But I'm also, so the microhistorical idea is that you can look with a microscope at a specific historical event to understand things that if you look from a distance, will miss. But in terms of narrative, because of the richness of the archive, I'm also inspired by the American school of microhistory that pays specific attention to the type of narrative, a very thick and engaging narrative that I want to use to tell my story eventually when I'll set up and sit down and write the book. But I'm also inspired by Stephen Fireman's plea to abandon those narratives that, according to him, still dominate African history, that are rooted, as he says, in Europe, to try to produce some micro-histories that questions these macro narratives. In fact, I'm a little bit, on a different level from Fireman, who argues that it is important to produce new macro narratives to counter these European-centered macro narratives. But I do believe that micro narratives, micro histories can at least start questioning the greater macro narrative that's still dominated. So what is the macro narrative? For some reason, my animations have been messed up here. So what is the macro narrative that I'm trying to question? So it's this idea that the 19th century always need to be seen, from the perspective of the knowledge of the establishment of colonialism that gets projected back in time. So we always interpret the events of the 19th century, especially when they involve European actors, as steps towards, the imposition of European colonialism, doing, what Fred Cooper calls doing history backward. So I think that, on the contrary, the kind of archive that I'm using allows us to understand what the encounter with Barth did for Aḥmad al-Bakkāy. So I'm trying to flip the narrative and see the story of his encounter with this clearly imperial agent from the point of view of Aḥmad al-Bakkāy and what he did to foster his own agendas. So Barth was very much conscious of the fact that he was a pound. He says at some point, I'm here caught into a bigger story. What is this bigger story that Barth found himself cut off? There is here a substantial tension at different levels that al-Bakkāy is trying to kind of fix, or in a way act upon, thanks to his connection with Barth. So at a local level, while we assume that al-Bakkāy was undisputedly the leader of the junta, in fact, there were many contenders to the leadership of the family. So by imposing on the family his own point of view that Barth was supposed to be protected, Bakkāy is in fact demonstrating that he's the one who set up the behavior of the junta. That's first, very localized. Then at a regional level, which is the one that we can really understand through the Brown collection, this here basically is a conflict of authority on who is in fact running business in Timbuktu. And then at a global level, I'm not going to touch on this, the opportunity is offered by Barth to al-Bakkāy is that of establishing connections with the British, who were at the time, fostering, so-called idea of imperialism of free trade, at the time in which, in fact, the French were way more threatening as an actor on the ground, considering that they were coming down from Algeria, conquering many of those commercial Saharan ports that were very much connected to the economic and the political life of Timbuktu. So in which way, which document I can use from the Brown collection to go deep into this story? I'm going to use 3 documents in detail that will show you the Timbuktu side of this story. So these 2 manuscripts on the side are actually not from the Brown collection, but they're very important documents because these are the 2 documents that trigger the conflict. Because on the left, you will have, you see the letter from Aḥmad III, the ruler of Amdallahi, to Aḥmad al-Bakkāy, saying, I know that you are hosting a Christian who is illegal in the country, you need to deliver to me. This one is the letter from the same ruler to the local emir of Timbuktu, so the person who was in charge of the city on behalf of Amdallahi, saying, go get this guy and deliver it to me. So this really at the beginning of the story. But let's look at the manuscripts in the Brown collection and see what they can tell us about the history of this Timbuktu side of the story I'm trying to tell. So first, there is a very long letter. This is a painful document from Aḥmad al-Bakkāy to Aḥmad III that is very much widespread in West African collections. I don't really know why this is being copied in multiple in multiple manuscripts. It is telling us that this was a very important document. The good thing is that this long manuscript has been edited and translated by my colleague from the Ahmed Baba Center in Timbuktu, Mohammed Jagayet. I'm relying partly on his edition. I'm going to pull out some quotations from the letter. This is like 15 pages long letters. This is not like very accurate translation. It's more kind of capturing the meanings. I'm not yet at the stage of a proper translation of these documents. So in this letter, we can see that al-Bakkāy keeps on receiving letters from Aḥmad III. They say, I found them very strange. And it was even dismissed. I thought of not responding, but eventually I did. Say, I would have never expected that somebody like you can be so ignorant to request basically that this guy who's under my protection needs to be handed over to you. Then he'll continue saying that Barth had entered the, this land knowing that he was not violating any basically commandments that Muslims were supposed to respect. And indeed, he's been traveling for 10 years in Muslim lands and nobody bothered. He continues by saying that despite the fact that he entered the territories of Amdallahi without you not knowing about him, doesn't mean that you have the right to capture him. And he goes on and saying, all the Christians nowadays, with the exception of the Russians, are in fact in a covenant with the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul-Majid, and as such, you have no authority of harming them because they're in a state of peace with the Muslims, except for the Russians. And then he continues. Now the tone of the letter gets bad. He says, at the end of the day, you are not the leader of the region. Our ultimate authority is the Sultan of Morocco, Abdurrahman, the Alawi ruler of Morocco. You are just the emir of a small state between Amdallahi and Timbuktu, only 5 days journey at most extreme of the land of the Sudan in the west. So basically, you're nothing. This is what Bakkāy is telling to Aḥmad III. You are pretending to be ignorant because you just want his wealth. And then he continued by saying, if killing this Christian intruder was something that was required by law, I would have been the first one to do it. So And since I didn't do it, you can do it. You cannot even think about that. Saying, that's very typical of Bakkāy. Bakkāy is a very interesting character. He's saying, if you really wanted to learn about this thing, you should have just reached out to me. I could have explained you the regulations of these matters. Then he goes in a long description of what are the rules of jihad, and basically say there's no jihad to do against Barth and the British specifically, because Barth is representing the British. Then he says, my family supported you from the very beginning when you were weak. Now look what you're doing. You've become powerful. You're going to basically against us. And then he says, in the past, another Christian came in our lands. And neither your dad or your grandfather, the previous rulers of Amdallahi, harmed it. It's kind of questionable because he's referring to a Scottish traveler, Gordon Lang, who is in fact killed in Timbuktu, but that's part of the story. It's not really in the letter. But then, the letter finishes with a positive outcome because it looks like the original letter that is not in the Brown collection was basically also an attempt to reconcile with Aḥmad al-Bakkāy. So Bakkāy accepts the reconciliation, and indeed, Barth is allowed to leave, as I mentioned, in March of that same year. So what is interesting is that this letter is really a lesson on Islamic jurisprudence given by Aḥmad al-Bakkāy to Aḥmad III. It scolds the arrogance and the ignorance of Aḥmad III. It shows them continued protection, ensured continuous protection to Barth. But as you can see, Bakkāy is referring to previous letters that he received. So we can see that this is the culmination of a set of exchanges that existed before, that are implied in the letter. And in fact, in the Brown collection, we have another manuscript that is one of these earlier letters that Bakkāy wrote in response to previous messages from Aḥmad III. I'm not going to go in detail in this because this is the same arguments that basically reproduced. What is interesting here is that despite the fact that this particular letter is not signed, I mean, we don't really know the name of the copies by what is written, I know the handwriting of this guy. So the person who copied for William Brown this manuscript is a very famous Timbuktu scribe who worked for the workshop of Ahmed Boularaq. You remember the Moroccan trader and bibliophile. So the copyist was named Abdurrahman bin Sidi. So one of the most prominent copyists of Timbuktu was copying manuscripts for William Brown. Another, demonstration of the strong connection that Brown had established with leading intellectuals in the region. Then, I was thinking about Sandra last night and your passion for Arabic poetry. So this is a poem that we have in two copies of another attack, straightforward attack that most likely predates the letters that I looked at in detail from Bakkāy to Barth, but nice because it's written in verses. So these letters basically is it's in rhyme D, so all the verses finish in D. There's 32 verses, and it's in a typical meters of Arabic poetry, rajads. And it opens with one of these typical Bakkāy formulas. I say, did Aḥmad III really send me a messenger? And then he injects a racial tone that is very characteristic and disturbing of Bakkāy's writing. Not just a messenger, a black messenger, to ask him to deliver Barth so that he could be robbed and imprisoned. Was he asking this while he was awake? I think he was sleeping. And then he continues listing all of those supporters of his that accept his religious authority and are ready to actually step up to defend Aḥmad al-Bakkāy. He mentions major Tuareg leaders of Tuareg group of the region, even the rulers of the more distant Sokoto Caliphate in what is today's Nigeria. Then he continues, even all the men of God from among your Fulani supporters, they are in fact not with you, they are with you. And he basically says, I have all of these supporters, but the biggest supporters for me is God. So you should actually repent for your actions and listen to what I'm saying. Let Barth go. Leave me alone. If you don't want to end up like the Pharaoh, Nimrod, Ad, Shaddad bin Ad, were all Quranic figures who basically rebelled against God and perished. So this letter is also interesting because it continues showing this very aggressive almost threatening attitude of Bakkāy against Aḥmad III, and demonstrate that he can mobilize his religious authority into military support. It shows that poetry was also used as a means to convey, these kind of messages. I mean, the Sahara is full of poems that are used for multiple purposes. And then eventually, this is one of the examples of this racial tone that al-Bakkāy employs, claiming to be descendant of the Quraysh, so the tribe of the Prophet, vis-a-vis the local West African intellectual and political elites. And then I'm going to conclude with one manuscript, which is my favorite manuscript. That is this short one you can see with number 10. This comes from a collection of letters that were copied together for Brown, which is not written by Bakkāy, it's not written by Barth, it's not written by Aḥmad III. It's written by another scholar and a kind of political figure of Timbuktu to an unnamed recipient, and he's complaining about al-Bakkāy's behavior. So who was the sender of this letter? Is an important figure in Timbuktu. So this guy was called Sanchirfi. Sanchirfi was one of the most important notable of Timbuktu after the establishment of the Caliphate of Hamdallah. He was installed first as the official scribe, then he became the imam of the main mosque, then the chief judge, and for a time it was also the Timbuktu rulers on behalf of Hamdallah. So he was pretty much connected to the caliphate. It was so important that he also managed to kind of transfer his prestige to his descendants. Even during the first colonial period, the early judges of Timbuktu during the French colonial period were the grandsons of Sanchirfi. So it's not like a obscure scholar from the region. But what is interesting is that this letter shows up how local people felt about al-Bakkāy's behavior. So it says this affair started from one of mediation, which, as we have seen, was a typical role that Bakkāy occupied in the social and political landscape of Timbuktu. But then he moved one of rulership. So Bakkāy stops behaving and somebody who's interested in mediation is actually now pretending to be the ruler of the city. And it says very clear, if he acts as if he had authority, he exceeds his boundaries, and he does not even seek approval or even, let his business known to the emir of the city, the legitimate emir of the city. He say he does not really like that anybody in the city has any form of authority or makes any decision without his agreement. So this letter is very interesting because it's a quite unique case of the perception of this main story as seen from actors who are not directly involved in the story that I'm telling you. So I think this is very interesting because it allows us to have a more comprehensive understanding of what was going on the ground then. And then I also want to use this very last manuscript to tell you a little bit about what happens to the manuscript that were produced because of Brown's missions in West Africa. So the manuscript I showed you, that letter from Sanchirfi, as I mentioned, comes from a collection of letters that were 20, called the Diwan Rasail Timbuktu, so this collection of letters from Timbuktu, that were copied all from the same library, the Moroccan bibliophile Aḥmad Boularaf. So we can assume that a copyist that I could not locate yet put together several letters from this collection of this Moroccan bibliophile and put them together into one manuscript. You can see this is like, the school book is a notebook. It's not like ancient paper or anything. So once this manuscript was copied for Brown, Brown did not take the manuscript. He took pictures of the manuscripts. The manuscript was in fact left in Timbuktu. And we know that at some point, according to my reconstruction of the history of the Ahmed Baba Center of Timbuktu, where this manuscript eventually found its way into, arrived in roughly around 1976. So a manuscript copied for Brown, left by Brown, is then acquired by the State Archive in Timbuktu. But then, if you remember, I mentioned that the 5 reels from Brown also find their way in North America into this project that we call the Malian Arabic Microfilm Project. David Robinson and Louis Brenner went back to Mali and donated the microfilms of this project to the Ahmed Baba Center, who printed another copy of this manuscript. So right now what we have in Timbuktu the original copy, to which a new nice frontispins were added, so added after Brown left. Then we have the photocopy of the same manuscript that came from the United States after it was digitized, brought back, and then eventually found its way back into West Africa. So I think that the William Brown collection, in specific case of my research, does an incredible job in providing me the Timbuktu side of the story that I mentioned, basically letters between the main actors involved and other scholars who are not directly involved in this. So they really give that local side of the story to this broader Barth archive that is mostly, focused on the activities of the European who are, working around this connection between Barth and Bakkāy in Timbuktu. So I think I'm doing 44. I'm well with time. So I just want to conclude by basically remarking that Brown's mission of collection of manuscripts was not extractive, was not stealing manuscripts, was not impoverishing local libraries. He was actually getting reproduction of the manuscripts. His mission was always in collaboration with local scholars. I mean, the most obvious is his broker, Malik Yattara, but we have seen him interacting with local scholars, Abdallah Boularaf, Moulay Ahmed Baber, and even copyists like Abdurrahman bin Sidi. So what we can see is that Brown was not just a thorough researcher, but was also a collector of primary sources that he kept for himself for his research, but he also took care of leaving for next generations of scholars, and I was one of those who benefited from that. Thank you very much.